Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Border and Maritime Security will come to order. Subcommittee is meeting today to assess the federal and tribal efforts to combat human trafficking in the United States. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Human trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It enslaves approximately 25 million men, women, and children worldwide through sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, and forced labor. It's important to understand there's no one face of human trafficking. Truth is that traffickers do not discriminate when it comes to their victims. Victims can come from any background, of any age, like a teenage girl who ran away from home, only to be beaten, drugged, and forced to walk the streets. The migrant worker who paid a smuggler to help him cross the border, only to be forced into manual labor. Or an elderly woman lured by the promise of work in America and forced to spend endless hours cleaning the mansion of her captors. These examples are all too common. To many Americans, human trafficking may seem like a problem happening far away from home, but sadly that's not the case. During a human trafficking roundtable I led in my district back in 2015, we heard from a sex trafficking survivor named Beth Jacobs. She explained to us just how easy it was to become a victim. She was drugged at a party at the age of 16, then kidnapped and forced into prostitution. Over the course of 6 years, she was subjected to rapes, beatings, and forced commercial sex acts. I worked with Beth when I was serving on the Pima County Women's Commission, and I've been inspired by her courage as a survivor of these unconscionable crimes. Beth's not alone, unfortunately. Just last year, the Human Trafficking Institute reported there were 783 active human trafficking cases in the U.S. federal court system involving thousands of victims. Even more alarming is the fact that more than 55% of those cases involve sex trafficking of children. Yet, as these horrific cases are uncovered in communities across the United States, many people are still surprised at how close to home they actually are. Earlier this month, 24 people were arrested in a human trafficking sting in the Phoenix area of my home state in Arizona. Some of the defendants, ranging from age 21 to 80, are facing serious charges, including aggravated luring, child sex trafficking, and money laundering. We all need to wake up, because human trafficking is happening right here in our backyards, and the victims of the tragic crimes are often hidden in plain sight. I called this hearing to shine a light on the heinous crime of human trafficking and highlight the work being done by our federal agencies who partner with state, local, and tribal governments and law enforcement agencies to eradicate human trafficking from our streets, our local businesses, and our neighborhoods. I'm proud of the steps the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and their interagency task force partners are taking to combat all forms of human trafficking. At the federal level, the Human Smuggling and Trafficking Center serves as a clearinghouse for intelligence related to human trafficking. Representatives from DHS, DOJ, State Departments sit side by side, providing law enforcement partners with timely information on the trends and pushing out actionable case intelligence to jumpstart and bolster criminal investigations. Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, within ICE, leads the Department of Homeland Security's effort on human trafficking investigations and has accounted for 1,932 criminal arrests and 812 convictions in human trafficking cases in 2017 alone. The DHS Blue campaign, which was formally authorized, signed into law in February of this year, I was at the signing, thanks to the leadership of our chairman, McCall, is a unified effort by the department to conduct outreach and enhance awareness of trafficking and provide training and materials to those in the best position to identify the victims. The Blue Campaign works in collaboration with law enforcement, NGOs, and the private sector stakeholders to identify victims and train organizations on the indicators to look out for. DOJ plays a vital role in combating human trafficking and prosecuting those involved to the fullest extent of the law. Under the leadership of DOJ and in partnership with DHS and the State Department, the U.S. government works closely with our Mexican counterparts to develop high-impact bilateral trafficking investigations. These multifaceted prosecutions are aimed at dismantling international human trafficking networks that operate across the U.S.-Mexico border and are conducted through the U.S.-Mexico Bilateral Human Trafficking Enforcement Initiative. I look forward to hearing more about that today. Congress has made it a priority in a bipartisan way to pass legislation that would enable law enforcement, prosecutors, and other stakeholders to fight human trafficking. To name a few, over the last few years, we've reallocated existing grants for human trafficking deterrence and victim support, made it a federal crime to knowingly advertise for the commercial sex exploitation of minors and trafficking victims, enhanced the ability of healthcare professionals to identify victims, and provided the financial industry more tools to detect and deter money laundering attached to human trafficking. Criminals engaged in trafficking range from amateur, family-run organizations to sophisticated transnational organized crime syndicates. It's critical that we prosecute trafficking offenders who victimize vulnerable populations. We must support efforts to raise awareness and educate those who work in law enforcement, at ports of entry, in healthcare, in child protective services, and elsewhere to identify trafficking. We must also ensure that victims receive the care they need after they've been rescued. This is a complex and multifaceted problem. There are no quick or easy solutions, but I do take comfort in knowing that the brave men and women within the Department of Homeland Security and DOJ are tracking these criminals down and saving these victims. I look forward to hearing from our federal and tribal witnesses today on their experiences in combating human trafficking and what more we have to do. It's my hope, with the help of your testimony, we will raise awareness on this issue and identify solutions that will have an impact on human trafficking throughout the nation. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vela, for a statement he may have.
Thank you, Chairwoman McSally and Chairman McCall, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to all of our witnesses for taking the time to be here with us. Human trafficking is one of the most profitable forms of transnational crime. The International Labor Organization estimates that forced labor generates annual profits of $150 billion per year and claims more than 20 million victims worldwide. Trafficking victims can be of any age, race, gender, or nationality, and are largely found in workplaces within the manufacturing, agriculture, hospitality, and domestic service industries. The federal government has a significant role to play in building capacity, resources, and synchronization among communities, local government, and international partners. However, one area that I believe we are overlooking are tribal lands. Last year, the Government Accountability Office issued 2 related reports about the number of investigated and prosecuted human trafficking cases that involved American Indians and Alaska Native victims and that occurred on tribal lands. The Departments of Justice, Interior, and Homeland Security each have some form of responsibility for investigating and prosecuting human trafficking crimes on tribal lands. 49 of the 94 U.S. Attorney's offices include Indian country within their jurisdiction. However, 3 out of 4 of these federal entities do not require their agents or attorneys to consistently collect or record the race or ethnicity, including Native American status, of victims in their cases. As a result, the total number of federal human trafficking investigations and prosecutions that involve Native American victims is unknown. We also do not know how many Native American victims receive services under federal grant programs intended to assist human trafficking victims for much the same reason. Grantees are not required to capture this information. This seems like a major gap and makes it difficult for us to understand the full scope of the problem. Despite our best efforts to encourage more interagency coordination, improve law enforcement training and resources for victims, and push out more awareness campaigns, we do not know how effective or helpful they may be if we don't fully understand the full scope of people affected by human trafficking or why they may be vulnerable. For this reason, I thank Judge Michelle Demert for accepting our invitation to testify. She serves as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for the Tlingit and Haida tribes of Alaska, and she also serves as the co-chair of the National Congress of American Indians Task Force on Violence Against Women. I found the statistics you shared in your written testimony sobering, and I am pleased that the committee will get the benefit of your views on this issue, given your long experience fighting on behalf of American Indian and Alaska Native women and children who have been subjected to this and other forms of violence. I would like to hear from you on what more needs to be done to improve services to victims and to help bring traffickers to justice. As the ranking member of this subcommittee, I was glad to co-sponsor and support passage of the Department of Homeland Security's Blue Campaign Authorization Act of 2017. The Blue Campaign brings DHS components together with federal, state, local law enforcement agencies and private industry to dismantle human trafficking networks across the country. I would like to hear from our DHS and DOJ witnesses today about how this and other federal efforts underway assist tribal law enforcement in addressing human trafficking on their lands. Federal programs and coordination are crucial in this fight, but there is clearly work left to do to ensure that vulnerable people across this country and around the globe are protected. My hope is that we all walk away today with a more meaningful understanding of how else we need to partner to end human trafficking and incorporate it into the national conversation. Thank you again to our witnesses for joining us today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, and the sponsor of the Blue Campaign legislation for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and ranking member Vela. Human trafficking is a despicable, multi-billion-dollar industry. It enslaves an estimated 25 million people worldwide, including more than 300,000 people in my home state of Texas, 80,000 of whom are minors. Many of these victims are sexually exploited or forced into slave labor. And to some Americans, trafficking may seem like an industry that only exists in poverty-stricken dictatorships or other poor parts of the world, but sadly, that is not the case. Trafficking is an epidemic, and it grows by the day. The Polaris Project reports that 1 in 20 men in the United States have purchased sex online. Traffickers are targeting our schools and preying on our kids through social media and apps on their phones. This evil industry is a global enterprise, and we must do more to fight it. I believe, like every issue, it starts with awareness. As a father of 5 children, I continue to be personally struck by the horrifying stories of trafficking victims. Last month, I visited Hope Rising, a rehabilitation program in Texas that matches trafficking victims with a foster family while they complete recovery therapy. It was a reminder that we need a proactive, not reactive approach to end this kind of exploitation. And that is why many years ago I created the Internet Crimes Against Children Unit when I was Deputy Attorney General for the state of Texas under then Attorney General John Cornyn. This has since led to the prosecution of hundreds of online child predators. I've also worked closely with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which serves as a central source in the United States for information of child victims depicted in sexually exploitive images and videos. And earlier this year, I stood in the Oval Office and watched the President sign the Blue Campaign Authorization Act into law. This was bipartisan legislation that I introduced that provides resources to DHS to help deter, detect, and mitigate instances of human trafficking around the United States. It also protects victims and helps raise public awareness of human trafficking threats throughout our communities. And while I'm proud of what we have accomplished, I believe there's much more to be done. I'm eager to continue this fight with anyone who wants to stop human trafficking. And I think today's hearing will give us a chance to discuss innovative ways to continue our efforts. I want to thank the witnesses for being here and your work on this very important issue that's becoming, as I said, an epidemic. I have to say I've heard countless stories, and not just inner city stories, but suburban parents whose daughters and sons have been swept up into this industry and they can't get them back. Some people, they don't know that exists in suburban America, but it does. And we want to do something about it on this committee. And I want to thank the chairwoman for holding this hearing. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gentleman yields back. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have 4 distinguished witnesses before us today. Assistant Secretary John Hill is responsible for the Department of Homeland Security Office of Partnership and Engagement, or OPE. Is that how you say it, or do you have an acronym, OPE or something? Okay. OPE coordinates DHS outreach to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments and local law enforcement, the private sector, and colleges and universities. In 2014, then Indiana Governor Mike Pence appointed Mr. Hill as his Deputy Chief of Staff for Public Affairs, where he oversaw all of Indiana's public safety agencies. Mr. Hill has more than 40 years of experience in public service at the federal and state level. Welcome. Special Agent Stephen Kagan, pronounce that correctly, is currently the Special Agent in charge for Homeland Security investigations in ICE under Department of Homeland Security in Denver, Colorado, and is responsible for leading criminal investigations conducted by 18 HSI offices in cities throughout Colorado, Montana, Utah, and Wyoming. As a temporary assignment, Mr. Kagan held the position of Acting Director of the Human Smuggling and Trafficking Center, which is an interagency fusion center and information clearinghouse focused on advancing and supporting efforts to combat human trafficking with a nexus to the United States. Since beginning his career in 1988, he's worked across the country and abroad to combat drug and human trafficking, money laundering, and arms trafficking, just to name a few. Welcome. Acting Assistant Attorney General John Gore oversees the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, which also encompasses the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit. Before joining the Department of Justice, Mr. Gore was a partner in the Issues and Appeals practice at Jones Day in Washington, D.C. His practice spanned all phases of appellate and trial litigation and a broad range of substantive areas, including voting rights, administrative law, antitrust, and products liability. Prior to entering private practice, Mr. Gore clerked for the Honorable Bruce Selya on the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. I appreciate you coming today, since DOJ is not under our jurisdiction, but this is a really important conversation to have cross agencies. So thanks for being here. And finally, the Honorable Judge Demert. Did I say that correctly? No, tell me. Demert. Okay, Demert. Emphasis on the first syllable. Demert is a current elected delegate for the Central Council, Tlingit, and Haida tribes in Alaska. She's also the National Congress of American Indians Violence Against Women Task Force co-chair. Throughout her career, Judge Demert has worked in various capacities of advancing domestic violence protections for women and children. She has significant tribal court experience, having worked at various positions in the Northwest Intertribal Court System, including Chief Judge and Administrator. Welcome. The chair now recognizes Assistant Secretary Hill for 5 minutes to testify.
Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Vela, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss the Department of Homeland Security's awareness and outreach efforts to combat human trafficking. On behalf of Secretary Nielsen and the more than 230,000 men and women of DHS, I thank Chairman McCall and this committee for its continued dedication to this bipartisan issue, including the passage of the Department of Homeland Security Blue Campaign Authorization Act, which you folks referenced in your opening comments. Human trafficking is a heinous crime. Traffickers use force, fraud, or coercion to compel their victims into labor or commercial sex. Sadly, during my 29 years of law enforcement experience, I witnessed the devastating effects of people caught in such circumstances. However, I was never provided training in human trafficking, and even now, such training is desperately needed for more state and local law enforcement. DHS is working to provide that needed training. The Blue Campaign, which was created in 2010 and is housed within the Office of Partnership and Engagement, develops general awareness training and materials to increase detection of human trafficking and to identify victims for first responders, law enforcement, governmental, non-governmental, and private sector entities. DHS works collaboratively with interagency partners to ensure that victims are protected and traffickers are brought to justice. For example, through the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, this entity was created by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. DHS works with 15 federal agencies responsible for coordinating the federal government's effort to combat trafficking in persons. Also, DHS works jointly with the U.S. Department of Transportation to provide human trafficking training and information to aviation personnel through the Blue Lightning Initiative, which creates training tools that allow airline personnel to identify potential human trafficking situations and to report their suspicions to law enforcement. More than 100,000 aviation industry employees have been trained through this effort. The Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act of 2015 contains provisions mandating the DHS implement human trafficking training for relevant department personnel. Of the identified DHS employees, over 133,000 have been trained to date. In 2018, the Blue Campaign launched a new human trafficking and Native communities scenario video by engaging with Native American survivors of trafficking. The video depicts what human trafficking can look like in Native communities, including recruiting tactics used by traffickers. Additionally, the Blue Campaign strives to provide culturally relevant information to tribal communities. This effort included a visit in August of 2017 with our team, and they collaborated on a number of training and education efforts with Alaska Human Trafficking Working Group, as well as the mayor of Anchorage. Also this year, the Blue Campaign began leveraging social media and has secured more than 46,000 Twitter account followers. We implemented a digital advertising strategy with over 830,000 visits to our Blue Campaign website afterwards and 4.5 million social media interactions. The Blue Campaign recognizes that these and other awareness efforts play a vital role in ensuring the public is able to recognize the critical and information that's important to law enforcement for investigation and hopefully the prosecution of traffickers. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Special Agent Kagan for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman McSally, Chairman McCall, and Ranking Member Vela, and distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to represent HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. As one of the 26 Special Agent in charge, I can attest to the HSI's commitment to identifying and assisting victims and bringing traffickers to justice. For decades now, HSI has been seeing the same types of cases involving agriculture, construction, domestic work, restaurants, massage parlors. Essentially jobs with low pay and few legal protections in an underground economy and in a service industry. Many of these workers may be visible to us, but what we can't see is the fear, debt bondage, psychological coercion, threats, and harms that their traffickers inflict. They are indeed hidden in plain sight. When I led HSI's human trafficking effort last year, I learned about an investigation out of Jacksonville, Florida, that has truly stuck with me to today. In 2012, Estella Clark went to her native Mexico, where she met a young woman who agreed to be a pregnancy surrogate, medically supervised, in exchange for thousands of dollars. Clark had the victim smuggled across the border and undertook insemination, not with a doctor, at home with syringes. And when there was no pregnancy, she started to force the victim into unwanted sex with strangers. Over a period of 2 years, Clark threatened to harm the victim's family in Mexico, forced her to engage in domestic work, became physically abusive, and fed her beans while making her sleep on the cold floor. I chose this case to illustrate a few things. First, some cases like Clark involves traffickers recruiting and smuggling victims into the United States and where they are compelled into labor or sex, commercial sex. However, there are many cases where the victims arrive on visas or are already in the United States before they are trafficked. There's also cases involving U.S. citizens. Second, the Clark case demonstrated that traffickers and victims can be of any age, ethnicity, race, gender identity, immigration status, socioeconomic level. Traffickers can be relatives, friends, gang members, members of transnational criminal organizations. They can operate alone or they can operate in groups. They can actually be the couple next door. They are all driven by greed. Third, I am pleased to report the victim receives services, along with continued presence, allowing her to remain in the United States with work authorization to facilitate the investigation and prosecution of her trafficker. We have seen time and time again that law enforcement officers who work with victim assistance personnel have more stable victim witnesses and stronger investigations. Clark was sentenced this year to 7 years in prison for forced labor. HSI participates in more than 120 human trafficking task forces, consisting of federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement, as well as victim service providers. On average, HSI conducts 1,000 human trafficking investigations annually, identifies and assists hundreds of victims, conducts extensive local outreach and training, and generates leads and trains foreign law enforcement partners. Our human trafficking mission is twofold. Number one, we proactively identify cross-border trafficking organizations and minimize the risk they pose to national security and public safety. And number two, we employ a victim-centered approach, which has equal value on the identification and stabilization of victims and on investigation and prosecution of their traffickers. Alongside special agents are victim assistance specialists in the field who are vital to stabilizing that victim. This small group but growing program is essential to HSI investigations. A provision for its expansion to be truly commensurate with our investigations is included in the reauthorization of the TVPA. In conclusion, let me bring you back to our trafficker, Miss Clark. A neighbor called police after seeing the victim outside Clark's house washing a car and wearing clothing inappropriate for the freezing weather. This shows that collectively we have come a long way, because when the TVPA was enacted 18 years ago, few people knew what trafficking was, let alone how to respond to it. It takes public awareness, like the Blue Campaign's efforts, dedicated prosecutors, like my friends at the Department of Justice, and investigators, like HSI, trained and ready to employ a victim-centered approach while bringing the traffickers to justice. Thank you for shining a light on human trafficking and for the opportunity to appear here today.
Thanks, Special Agent Kagan. Chair now recognizes Assistant Attorney General Gore for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Vea, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I thank you for this important opportunity to discuss the Department of Justice's extensive efforts to combat human trafficking. The Department is resolutely committed to eradicating the scourge of human trafficking from our communities and our country, to holding perpetrators accountable, and to bringing justice to the victims and survivors of this destructive crime. Make no mistake about it, human trafficking is a civil rights and public health crisis in this country. Human trafficking is often referred to as modern-day slavery. Its victims are denied their freedom. They suffer horrific psychological and physical abuse, including violence, sexual abuse, substance abuse, mental manipulation, malnutrition, and neglect. It's hard to understand this kind of cruelty and shocking to contemplate its scope. Sadly, human trafficking is everywhere. In the hospitals where we receive care, in the hotels where we stay, in the restaurants where we eat, in the airports, bus stations, and train stations where we travel, in the cities, large and small, poor and prosperous, where we live, and of course, online. Human trafficking not only devastates lives, it also undermines the security of our communities, the integrity of our borders, and the rule of law. For these reasons, the Attorney General has declared that combating human trafficking is one of the Department's top priorities. The Department's crime reduction and public safety strategy calls for aggressive and coordinated efforts to eliminate human trafficking from the country. The Department is currently prosecuting unprecedented numbers of human traffickers. 2017 was a record-setting year for our enforcement efforts. Last year alone, we obtained convictions of 499 human traffickers, a record and a 14% increase over the prior year. We also secured indictments in a record 282 cases involving 553 defendants. We could not achieve these record-setting results without strong partnerships across the executive branch with the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Labor, the Department of State, and the Department of Health and Human Services. For example, the Civil Rights Division's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit is leading a groundbreaking anti-trafficking initiative across the executive branch. That initiative, called the Anti-Trafficking Coordination Team, or ACT-TEAM initiative, convenes and coordinates interagency teams of federal agents and prosecutors in select districts. And so far, the results of this initiative have been tangible. In Phase 1, human trafficking prosecutions more than doubled in the ACT-TEAM districts compared to more modest gains in other districts. Phase 2 is still underway, but so far it has produced promising results, including a significant prosecution of 38 individuals for operating a transnational trafficking enterprise that exploited Thai women, hundreds of Thai women, all across the United States. We also rely on strong partnerships with state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies. The Department invests heavily in training and funding programs to help build the capacity of those agencies to combat human trafficking within their jurisdictions. Moreover, in consultation with state, local, and tribal law enforcement leaders, every United States Attorney's Office in the country has devised and implemented a district-specific strategy to combat human trafficking with specific details on the coordination of investigations, enforcement actions, and victim and survivor support. Human trafficking is a crime that knows no boundaries, so neither can our enforcement efforts. The U.S.-Mexico Bilateral Enforcement Initiative, which the Department leads in partnership with Homeland Security and Mexican authorities, has enabled us to bring high-impact prosecutions against transnational trafficking enterprises operating along the U.S.-Mexico border. Through the initiative, U.S. and Mexican authorities share intelligence, leads, evidence, and tactical analysis. This international collaboration has allowed us to increase and enhance our ability to identify, interdict, and dismantle brutal trafficking enterprises. The initiative has led to many prosecutions in Mexico and the United States, including federal prosecutions of over 170 defendants in this country. Last year, we secured convictions of all 8 members of a notorious sex trafficking enterprise that lured vulnerable young women and girls on false promises, smuggled them into the United States, coerced them into prostitution for over a decade, and laundered the criminal proceeds back to Mexico. With the assistance of our outstanding Mexican counterparts, we executed a simultaneous takedown on both sides of the border and secured the extradition of 5 defendants to the United States. The Department's enforcement efforts have taught us an important lesson. Our work is most effective when it remains survivor-centered and trauma-informed. Our work is not complete until victims and survivors of human trafficking have been able to put their lives back together. Victim and witness coordinators from the Civil Rights Division, the Criminal Division, the FBI, and United States Attorney's offices work tirelessly to provide support and stability to victims in areas such as housing, medical care, and counseling. The Department's Office of Justice Programs also administers the largest amount of federal funds dedicated to helping human trafficking survivors in the United States. Thanks to the Congress, that amount totals $77 million for fiscal year 2018. That money funds victim service providers, training programs, public awareness, and 29 anti-trafficking task forces all across the country, comprised of federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement, and community and faith-based organizations dedicated to providing services to survivors. In fiscal year 2017, Department of Justice grantees reported assisting a total of 8,003 clients and training more than 56,000 people on how to identify and assist human trafficking survivors. The Department's commitment to the robust and victim-centered enforcement of the human trafficking laws that the Congress has enacted will never falter. Our commitment is robust. Together, we can eliminate this scourge of human trafficking and make our communities and our country more free, more fair, more open, and more safe. I thank you for this invitation and look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Judge Demert for 5 minutes to testify.
Thank you, Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Vela, and distinguished members. I am pleased to be here today to address trafficking and its impact on Native American communities. Thank you so much for recognizing the impact trafficking has on our communities and your interest in involving our tribes in the solutions. This will be key. Trafficking in multiple forms has been utilized as a tool of genocide and colonization of American Indians and Alaska Natives within the United States, first contact with Europeans. This practice continues today in different forms. In the United States, there is no tracking method that provides a complete picture of sexual exploitation or human trafficking. The data that is available supports the conclusion that our women, our tribal women, are trafficked at disproportionately high rates. Yet, a recent GAO report found that from 2013 to 2016, there were only 14 federal investigations and 2 federal prosecutions of human trafficking offenses in Indian country. Traffickers prey on persons perceived to be vulnerable. Our women and girls have many of the indicators that increase vulnerability, including being a relatively young, high-poverty population, high rates of homelessness and substance abuse, high rates of past violent victimization, and a lack of resources and support services. In Alaska, our women and girls represent a disproportionate number of trafficked girls in relation to the population. It is reported that 28% of the youth at the Covenant House, Alaska, were survivors of human trafficking, and that these cases were some of the worst in the nation. Current federal law limits the authority of Indian nations to fully protect victims of crime and respond to crimes of trafficking that occur on our lands because criminal jurisdiction is divided among federal, tribal, and state governments. Depending on the location of the crime, the type of crime, the race of the perpetrator, and the race of the victim, the confusing jurisdictional scheme often leads to a failure to act. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled in Oliphant versus Suquamish that absent specific direction from Congress, tribal nations do not have jurisdiction over crimes committed by non-Indians in Indian country. According to a Senate Committee on Indian Affairs report, quote, criminals tend to see Indian reservations and Alaska Native villages as places they have free reign where they can hide behind the current ineffectiveness of the judicial system. Without the authority to prosecute crimes of violence against women, a cycle of violence is perpetuated that allows and even encourages criminals to act with impunity in tribal communities and denies Native women equality under the law by treating them differently than other women in the United States. And again, Alaska has a uniquely complex jurisdictional arrangement, and no solution has yet been legislated. Unfortunately, the amendments included in VAWA 2013, creating a framework for some tribes to exercise jurisdiction over domestic violence crimes, are limited in scope and do not reach sex trafficking crimes. What can be done? There are several bills currently pending before Congress that would help achieve these goals. H.R. 6545, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2018, would make clear that tribal courts can hold anyone who traffics American Indians or Alaska Natives in Indian country accountable for their crimes. However, this act wouldn't help Alaska Natives because of their jurisdictional issues. H.R. 4608, the Survive Act, would amend the Victims of Crime Act to provide services and compensation to trafficking and other crime victims in tribal communities. S. 3280, the End Trafficking of Native Americans Act, would improve coordination among federal agencies. Taken together, these three bills would significantly improve access to justice and services for American Indian and Alaska Native trafficking victims. I urge you to support these bills, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Gunas Chish Hawa, thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. I really appreciate all the verbal and written testimony. One thing that was in some of your written testimony that I want to highlight and ask a question on is this deeply troubling dynamic of traffickers taking advantage of people who are perhaps recovering or suffering from opioid addiction. Where in some cases, I think one of your testimonies said as they're almost leaving rehab facilities, that they're in a vulnerable place to be captured, and that their traffickers then keep them addicted and then continue to keep them in slavery by continuing to provide them the opioids while they're trafficking and forcing them into slavery. This is deeply disturbing. There's a lot of attention lately on the opioid epidemic, this nexus between those that are struggling with addiction and those who are now potentially vulnerable to being trafficked is deeply disturbing to me. So Special Agent Kagan, can you share any trends or dynamics going on with that, or any others on the panel? I think it's really important for our listeners to understand that.
Definitely, and thank you for bringing that up because it is extremely important to us right now. And one of the things for HSI, that's why we're uniquely positioned to target trafficking, because we also work in the narcotics arena, whether it's coming from the transnational criminal organizations through the routes into the United States, which also brings humans and trafficking victims. We are seeing that, and that's one of the two things that we are focused on right now, and it's very interesting to talk about it here because we also discuss it at a local level with chiefs and sheriffs in things like HIDTA meetings when we're talking about narcotics, that we're also talking about how traffickers are, focused on people that are coming down. What they're doing is they're identifying people that are really vulnerable, coming down off an opioid high, coming out of a facility. We're also seeing them use opioids with vulnerable victims who have never used drugs before.
Okay.
Because once they get them hooked, now it's sad to say, but that renewable resource, whether it's cartels, mostly criminal gangs within the United States, or small lower level, and they just continue to keep them hooked on opioids while they are a renewable resource to whatever organization or whatever person is trafficking them in these horrible situations.
That's disgusting. Mr. Gore, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I would like to add something, and thank you, Chairwoman McSally, for raising an important question on this crucial issue. You're talking about the intersection of the civil rights and public health crisis that is human trafficking and the opioid epidemic sweeping all across the nation and leaving a wake of destruction behind it. We recently had a case, we secured a guilty plea back in July involving a man who had used opioid addiction to coerce two young women into commercial sex trafficking. He was giving them just enough heroin to maintain their addiction and prevent withdrawal, and then threatening to take their heroin away so that they would suffer the enormous physical pain of withdrawal if they refused to engage in commercial sex trafficking. He was from Massachusetts and was taking these women throughout New England to engage in coerced commercial sex. He was driving down I-95 with the victims and was physically abusing one of them in the car when a Good Samaritan passing by noticed this and called the authorities. And he was apprehended and is now pleaded guilty to these heinous and outrageous crimes. And I think it goes to a point you raised earlier, Chairwoman, that increasing public awareness on all of these fronts is extraordinarily important. Back when the TVPA was enacted, there wasn't widespread public awareness about it. Now we have more and more widespread public awareness, and hopefully there'll be increased public awareness about opioid withdrawal and the opioid crisis as well. And more people like that Good Samaritan passerby will speak out when they see indicators of human trafficking and other criminal activity.
Great, thank you. Another line I want to get into maybe more in the second round as well is any trends that you all are seeing related to traffickers using online tools or online recruitment or online manipulation to facilitate trafficking. Just in April of this year, the President signed the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act of 2017, making a federal crime for websites and bad actors like Backpage.com to facilitate illegal prostitution and other things. Are you seeing a trend in online activity, and is this law going to give you additional tools, and anything else you can share, Mr. Gore?
Yes, thank you. FOSTA is an extraordinarily important tool for law enforcement at the federal, state, local, and tribal levels. It, as you laid out, creates liability for website operators that knowingly advertise sex trafficking or intentionally facilitate prostitution. Of course, the advent of the internet has led to an explosion in human trafficking activity. It's created a new market where human trafficking can take place, where supply and demand can come together in ways that were not possible before, and we're seeing that all across the country and really all throughout the world. So FOSTA is an important tool that supplements departments' already existing enforcement authority, as was shown by the prosecution of Backpage.com in your home state of Arizona. And it also creates an important right of action for state attorneys general to combat human trafficking online, and we are actively engaged with state authorities to help build their capacity to do so.
Okay, great. I'm over my time. I wanted to come back to it in a second round, but the chair now recognizes Mr. Vela, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank all of you again. Mr. Kagan, did I get that right? And Mr. Gore, this question I think is for the two of you. And it kind of, I was wondering if you could elaborate on a point you touched on with respect to our levels of law enforcement cooperation with Mexican authorities, because it's something we don't often focus on. And, you know, in light of the indictments and extraditions of El Chapo Guzman and the former governor of Tamaulipas, Tomas Yaddington, which I think are success stories that the public doesn't often get to hear about. And I was wondering if you could explain, elaborate more on you know, how those efforts going forward are important to focus on, and how they help, how Mexican authorities help us with respect to not only prosecutions of criminals like El Chapo and Tomas Yaddington, but in the context of human trafficking.
Thank you for the question. I won't get into the particulars of the bilateral agreement because that's with Department of Justice, but what I can tell you is HSI, I was in Mexico, working in Mexico in 2009 when the bilateral agreement was signed around, and it continues. The continued work between our governments is something that is not talked about all that often, I will agree, but we are down there continually. We actually have a group, Human Trafficking Unit and Department of Justice's Human Trafficking Unit down there within Mexico City, meeting with the Mexican government next week in order to talk about some cases, some ongoing cases, also capacity building. We continually, Blue Campaign and ourselves continually work capacity building with the Mexican government, but also within the Northern Triangle region. It is something that is extremely important to us because what we need them to help us with is identifying any trafficking that they might see before it comes to the United States. So by bolstering their capacity within the entire region, it helps us try to combat this problem.
Mr. Kagan's absolutely right. The bilateral enforcement initiative has been extraordinarily important both to Mexican authorities and to the United States. Mexico remains the largest source country for foreign trafficking victims entering the United States. It's a huge problem here. It's also a huge problem in Mexico. And one of the great innovations of the bilateral enforcement initiative is it's allowed us to bring high-impact prosecutions that dismantle entire trafficking enterprises that operate on both sides of the border. Frequently what happens in these cases is individuals operating in Mexico lure young women and girls or other trafficking victims and then smuggle them into the United States, where they're coerced into sex trafficking or labor trafficking, and criminal proceeds are then laundered back to Mexico. We don't always have the tools or the opportunity or the enforcement resources to go after the individuals operating in Mexico, but the Mexican authorities do. And so when we work together with them, we can dismantle an entire enterprise, take it apart, save hundreds of victims, save hundreds more would-be victims who never get caught up in that particular enterprise. So it allows us to leverage our enforcement tools and resources for the most effective combating of human trafficking that we can do.
I have two quick questions on the same point. The first one's for you, Mr. Corey, the second one for Mr. Kagan. And that is, what is your sense, given the change of administrations in Mexico, and how that will affect our cooperative efforts to date? Will it be enhanced, disrupted, or do you see that it will continue the way it has been? And Mr. Kagan, when you talk about capacity, you're talking about capacity, I believe, on the Mexican side. And that's one thing I've wondered about, because I have worked with HSI officials that are in Mexico. And I'm curious about our capacity in terms of personnel needs and things like that on the HSI side to keep that process going forward.
Thank you, Ranking Member Vea, for that question. I think it's too early to tell if there's going to be any change in approach on the Mexican side of this equation, but we're optimistic and very hopeful that our efforts with the Mexican authorities will continue unabated. One of the great innovations of the bilateral enforcement initiative is that we've institutionalized the commitment on both sides of the border, both in the United States among our law enforcement and also in Mexico among their law enforcement. The department has a number of rule of law and justice reform initiatives in Mexico. We've been able to use those to leverage cooperation and assistance in the human trafficking sphere. And all of the teams that we've worked with of career prosecutors and investigators in Mexico have been thoroughly vetted and are resolutely committed to this effort and have been strong partners.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the representative from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Special Agent Cajun, how high is the confidence that your agents have on the border regarding actual identification of people coming across? And I'm speaking to ask your response on what is the quality level of false documents and identifications that you're encountering as we attempt to identify people coming into our nation?
Thank you for the question. That's a difficult question for me to answer. We are the criminal investigative arm of the department, and we are not called in until after United States Border Patrol or United.
Are you seeing false documents and identifications in case files that you're investigating?
Yes.
At the investigative level once they've been processed in the field?
Yes, we
What's your opinion of the quality of those false documents and identifications?
that they continue to get better. I've been doing it for 18 years. They definitely continue to.
Roger that. I asked this question because of my background in law enforcement. You know, we run across false IDs, and many years ago, almost a decade ago, we interviewed a gentleman with full investigative authority at the felony level, and he had in his possession over 150 stolen identity files, complete files, and he had a connection to make driver's licenses that were so close to the real thing. It required incredible scrutiny to discern the difference between the driver's licenses that this gentleman from Eastern Europe was able to create and after hours of interrogation with this gentleman, we were still not sure who he was. He was ultimately deported. So this was almost a decade ago. And you're familiar, I'm quite sure, Mr. Gore, with the equal protection under the law clause in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment to any person on our soil, correct?
Yes, I am.
Does that right extend to children that enter our nation illegally, accompanied by an adult?
I do believe it does, yeah.
Of course. So we're, as a compassionate nation of law and order, in order for a young man or woman that's been brought into our nation for the purpose of human trafficking, in order for them to get inserted into the criminal network domestically, they have to make it through border security. Am I correct? Either whether they're smuggled in or whether they're brought in plain view is the nature of this hearing. And isn't it our responsibility to determine who these people are?
Yes, it is.
Special Agent, yes?
Yes, it is, and I believe that the Customs and Border Protection and the U.S. Border Patrol, either at the ports, in any ports of entry, do everything that they can to identify who these people are, whether it's through interviews, using their background and knowledge on how to interview people and get people to talk to them. I think they do a great job at it.
I concur, and I bring up this subject because Mr. Gore, as representatives of the civil rights enforcement, essentially for the endeavors that we're discussing today, are we not as a nation committed to the unwavering protection of the civil rights, including of illegal aliens that come into our nation illegal because of the clearly stated verbiage of our Constitution and the amendments therein, as when they're on American soil, they deserve protections under the law, do they not?
Absolutely.
And so our very initial objective is quite challenging. I think America needs to know this because there's been a great deal of discussion about the rights of children. And we're discussing human trafficking today, which by its very nature means children. So as a young man or woman is brought into our nation, perhaps with the criminal intent of being inserted into a domestic criminal network of human trafficking, it is our absolute duty, Madam Chairwoman, my colleagues, to determine exactly who these adults are that are accompanying the children. And I'll leave with you, Mr. Hill, tell us to close, what a challenge that is for us as a nation.
Well, I would just say we have recognized in doing the outreach over the last, since the Blue Campaign was stood up in 2010, that this is a huge challenge for us. And we appreciate the efforts of the Authorization Act that was passed this past year, because I think it gives us institutional tools to help build up the staff that we need. Before we had the reauthorization, we were pulling people from different departments on details to try to fill this need to inform people. And so having the act is really going to institutionalize this process and get the word out. But it's in fiscal year 17, I believe there were 31,000 unaccompanied children that came to this country. And so 98% of them still are here. And we need to make sure that those people are identified during that process so that the trafficking symptoms are not evident with those children.
Gentleman kneels back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Correa from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for this most important hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses here today for your service to our country. You know, human trafficking is a very ugly issue, but it's one we have to look at head on. I represent Central Orange County, California, and Mr. Kagan, you talked about human trafficking, sex slaves, and U.S. citizens. The number one reason, or I should say, in our juvenile hall in Orange County, young ladies, the number one reason, the majority of them are there for prostitution. Underage young ladies, American citizens. Representing Central Orange County, it's a very blue-collar area, very heavily immigrant, heavily Latino, and also very heavily Asian. we have the biggest population concentration of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam. So I've gone out with public safety, and I've seen a lot of the human trafficking circumstances and situations in my county. Central Orange County, we have a lot of workers with and without documents, and many live in my district. And then they work in Newport Beach as nannies and doing other manual work. I had an employee in Newport Beach call me the other day and say, I need your help. I said, what can I do for you, ma'am? You're out of my district, but I'll help you. She says, a 20-year nanny just got arrested by ICE. Can you help me? My children are, you know, very concerned because this is a lady that's brought them up. These are the stories I hear over and over again. And yet today, you know, over the last 2 years, the administration has tightened up immigration policy, granting fewer visas, admitting fewer refugees, and really removing thousands of legal residents. And I would ask Mr. Hill and Ms. Demert, this is going to create a situation of supply and demand. The jobs are still there. My Central Valley farmers in California still need workers, yet less of them are able to come. So this is going to put a lot of pressure and really going to create more business for these smugglers to bring folks into the U.S. Am I reading this wrong, or thoughts on that point?
Well, Representative Correa, thank you for that question. I think there is definitely an attempt by the administration and specifically the USCIS to evaluate the visa process and to make sure that the right number of visas are being granted according to the caps that have been instituted by Congress. And so we are fully supportive of immigration reform. We would love to see Congress move in some of these areas, and we believe that that's an important initiative to address. But I will say to you that we are still getting lots of immigrants into this country. Since 2008, we've brought in 11 million immigrants into this country. And so and that's a huge number. I don't know if it addresses the labor issue as much, but it...
And I think that's what I'm getting at, because we can talk the actual numbers, or we can talk actual supply and demand. Again, when I have folks, farmers in Georgia or in my state of California, saying we need more workers, it tells me that there's either a mismatch on the immigrants, or the right kind of immigrants are coming to the U.S., or there's not enough of them.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we need to move toward requiring things like E-Verify that allows us to find out who should be here and make it easier for people that want to be getting jobs in America that are legally here, as opposed to these traffickers.
Let me just follow your logic. So you want E-Verify, and then what does that do for the supply of workers? Because I've talked to some of my local, you know, farmers in California, and they've said, you do E-Verify, and I'm out of business.
Well,
can you come to the rescue within 6 months? And I'm going to hold that thought, and we'll talk later on, because I also wanted to follow Mr. Vela's conversation about Mexico and their coordination on the asylum, the refugee seekers. It's my understanding that the Mexican government is doing a lot of work in the southern border of Mexico in checking asylum refugees and holding back a lot of them in the southern border. Do you have any information on that, or is there any coordination? And I asked also Ms. Demert also if you can answer that, because I believe you're part of the world. Alaska is also an area that we do have undocumented coming in. Is this an area of future challenges for the country in terms of immigration, with or without documents?
Well, I think that you always have a problem with undocumented individuals coming into areas that lack law enforcement, which Alaska really does. You know, 40% of our communities do not have law enforcement available, and so it's a prime area for people to come in and not fear the consequences. In terms of your questions about the labor issue, anytime you have those vulnerable communities who have a need and need to get work, they are at risk. They are at most risk for trafficking, because they're trusting, they're easily sold a line, and they trust people that they're going to be fair to them, and then they get trapped into some sort of labor or sex trafficking that they cannot get out of. And I just wanted to quickly add that in terms of Chairwoman McSally's point on the opioid issue, you know, we also had to come from it from a victim-centered point of view, in that women who are opioid dependent, who use, maybe distribute or possess, aren't thinking clearly, and they fear the consequences of the repercussions of being caught with that and being part of that, and so don't seek help for being trafficked under severe conditions of opioid use. And so figuring out how to provide treatment and also to provide some sort of safe haven for them to not be arrested is also very important. Thank you for the question.
Madam Chair, I think my time is
well
up. Thank you very much for your indulgence. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Demings from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you all as well for being here with us today. Mr. Gore and Justice Dermott, I want to thank you for really focusing on the victim and how we can better assist the victim. Mr. Gore, you talked about the intersection between human trafficking, public health, and addiction, and I think we all can do our jobs better if we approach these issues from a holistic standpoint. We've also heard about a victim-centered approach, and victims have to rebuild their lives and often need support to do just that. So I'd like to ask both of you, how often do you rely on victims? Because many of them come from very challenging environments. How often do you rely on victims to provide testimony against their trafficker? And how critical are victim assistance services in helping victims so that they can be effective witnesses that result in prosecution of the traffickers? Mr. Gore, we'll start with you. Thank you.
Thank you for that important question, Congresswoman Demings, because you've hit on an extraordinarily important issue, which is the survivor-centered and trauma-informed approach we try to take in our enforcement efforts at the Department of Justice. We use victims as witnesses in many, many cases. They are eyewitnesses to what they suffered. They are eyewitnesses to the trafficking enterprise and its operations, and they're eyewitnesses to the criminal activity. Our first and most important goal is to stabilize and support those victims with the services that they need. And so we do that, and then we help them prepare to be witnesses in cases that are appropriate. We also use victims and survivors to help us improve our training. Once they become stabilized and after their cases are over, we've had many survivors review our training materials and videos to make sure that they are accurately representing what goes on in a human trafficking scenario. We've even had victims and survivors participate in our trainings both internally to the Department of Justice and of state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies, because they bring a unique expertise and experience that we don't have as law enforcement agents. And that unique experience and expertise is very vital. We could not do our work, to answer the last part of your question, without victim service providers. They're absolutely essential, and they exist all across the country. They do training, they provide support and services to victims. We help fund those providers, but they go out and they do the very vital and important work of actually providing that service where it's most needed.
Thank you. Justice Demmer?
Thank you for the question. This is an important point that needs to be talked about for sure. Tribal governments have been largely left out of the Victims of Crime Act of 1984, and as a result of that, our victims really have a challenge in accessing services in this area. We thank the House for what you all did in the Appropriations Act of this year, and for the first time, we are accessing victims of crime funding, which will just really help us with this point. However, it is not a permanent fix yet, and we really need that. So we really need the Survive Act to have a consistent reliable, steady stream of funding that we can build programs and provide these services. The state of Alaska has not been very helpful at all in helping victims of crime. Many tribal communities don't even know that there's crime victim compensation available. So these trafficked individuals, they are just, you know, they're being helped by aunties, uncles, family members. They're not getting any real meaningful compensation or assistance. And so, so thank you very much. We really hope that the Survive Act or something similar will become a permanent fix so we can build these programs.
I know that the Minneapolis Police Department have experienced an increase in the number of victims that have been referred to them, and I believe that it is a result of the outreach efforts that have increased or been enhanced. Could you talk a little bit about those and what you believe could be done to further enhance our outreach efforts to reach potential victims?
Well, outreach is really, you know, I can't speak to Minneapolis, obviously, but in terms of outreach, the problem that we're having in Alaska in particular is that we are so under-resourced in terms of law enforcement and judicial services. Because of Public Law 280, we have not had the same sort of resources directed to Alaska tribal communities or urban areas. And so we've had to rely on state resources, and the state has not been a friend to Alaska Native women and children who are victims of trafficking. We had a heinous case out of Anchorage this last week in which a man who, and forgive me for being so candid, but who kidnapped a woman, a young Native woman, strangled her because that was the only way he could seek sexual pleasure, masturbated on her, and then left her in the woods. He got probation for this act of crimes. And so, you know, that just demonstrates the lack of trust that our communities have in a meaningful interaction with law enforcement in Alaska and with other state and federal agencies. And so the trust and the relationship building really needs to be built up in order for that to be effective. Thank you for the question.
Madam Chair, may I ask one additional question?
We're going to do a second round, if you don't mind.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Go back.
I yield back.
Okay, great. Gentlelady yields back. I appreciate the answers so far. There's just so much to talk about related to this issue. Special Agent Kagan, the work that you've described with HSI, HSI is part of ICE, and some of our colleagues and others have been calling to abolish that agency completely. Can you? I think that's a dangerous agenda. Can you speak specifically when it comes to human trafficking? What would happen if you were abolished, related to the efforts that are stopping, preventing, investigating, and holding people accountable in the human trafficking realm?
I can. Thank you for asking the question. And we don't agree. The special agent charges in the field and our ERO counterparts on the other side for immigration, we don't agree that abolishment of ICE is something that should happen. Our large breadth of authority, we investigate over 400 laws, and a lot of those fall on the immigration side, majority of them fall on the criminal side. And we believe that we need all of those authorities in order to attack a problem like this. We need the ability to investigate cartel-level perpetrators overseas, fall down into a sub-cartel level, and then also come down into the local gangs and or just your local neighbor who's involved in trafficking. So for us, it is imperative that we hang on to all of our authorities in order to enforce and go after the full scope of the criminal network, because we all know that it's not just human trafficking or just narcotics trafficking, that we need to be able to attack every piece of that network and able to dismantle the transnational criminal organization.
Great, thank you. I agree. One of the themes through much of the testimony today is the challenge that victims don't understand that they're a victim. So we can train over 100,000 law enforcement personnel and those in healthcare industries and other elements, but if a victim doesn't identify themselves as a victim for a variety of different reasons that are complex, then that still is a pretty significant challenge for us. How do we get to that? How do we get to It's part of the awareness campaign, I agree, for the public, for families, for everyone, what we're doing here today, so that there is we're able to attack the issue of victims thinking that somehow they're consenting to what they're involved in, or somehow, whatever the complex dynamics are. So, Mr. Hill, can you answer to that?
Well, I'll be glad to take a first crack at it for you. Chairwoman, I had the privilege of visiting with the Polaris Project recently, and they receive some funding from the Health and Human Services Administration for a hotline that was instituted several years ago. One of the things that I found very interesting during that visit is, not in addition to the work that they're doing and the number of calls that they're seeing increased over the last 4 years. They've seen a 100% increase in their calls. They've seen 130% increase in the number of cases that they're doing. They're also starting to move into this area that you referenced earlier in your question about social media. And what they're doing is they're doing live chat and text messaging, because every person who's a victim is also carrying a phone. And because their person who's trafficking them in many cases has to be able to communicate with them. And so what they're finding is that this new medium of outreach is helping to reach an area of the community that they hadn't previously been able to, and they've seen an exponential growth in that area. So I think the more awareness effort that we continue to publish those kind of access numbers and resources, I think we're going to continue to see this growth. But I think that we also have to target some of these populations, as the Native American and the Indian country. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And so I think we've got to continue to go into these areas of vulnerable communities.
Great. Special Agent Kagan?
I would love to answer the question, because I think it falls in line with Ms. Deming's question as well, which is we encounter on the streets, through our investigation, victims all the time that don't know that they're victims. Because of that, you asked the question, and thank you for asking about victim assistance specialists. It is imperative for us as agents, for much as I've got a 9-year-old daughter, for as much as I want to say that I'm a kind, gentle father, after I go in a house and pull a victim out, I'm not then the one that needs to stabilize that victim. We need the victim assistance specialist right next to us in the field in order to stabilize that victim initially. Let me explain. I've got a 4-state region: Utah, Colorado, Montana, Wyoming. For HSI, I have 1 victim assistance specialist. Jeez. That's why we are asking in the reauthorization of the TVPA, which I hope you support, to help us bolster. I need at least 1 per state. I need somebody next to those agents when they pull a victim out of this horrible situation, somebody who knows how to do it, somebody who can have that compassion. They're never going to see me as compassionate after we just broke down the door and pulled them out. I'm never going to be. But my victim assistance specialist for sure is that compassionate person. So for me, for us in the field, having that specialist to let the person know and get them to the point where they know they're a victim, because at that point, they probably still don't know they're a victim.
Great, thanks. I'm over my time. The chair now recognizes Ms. Demings from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. I ask permission to submit for the record a statement from the American Trucking Association detailing their work and efforts to use their 3.5 million truck drivers as eyes and ears to identify and report suspected human trafficking.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Oh, wait, you didn't have another question?
Actually, Special Agent Kagan answered it.
Okay,
Thank you so much for that.
All right.
You're
Well, I appreciate it. I just have a few more questions. One is just a question on the law, Mr. Gore, just to make sure I understand it. 22 U.S.C. 7102 defines sex trafficking, and at the end of it, it says, well, I'll just read the whole thing, is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of commercial sex act in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such act has not obtained the age of 18 years old. We also have some federal grants where we're trying to incentivize states that have laws that basically say if you're a child and you're involved in commercial sex, therefore you're being trafficked, like by definition. Can you clarify is the federal law say that if your child, whether they think they're doing it willingly or not, their child, that equals sex trafficking? And how does that actually get applied?
Yes, that's absolutely correct, Chairwoman. The way that human trafficking has been defined under federal law, any minor that goes into commercial sex trafficking is being trafficked by definition. And that is an important piece of our enforcement efforts. We have in the criminal division, the child exploitation and obscenity section is responsible for enforcing that particular aspect of the human trafficking laws. It has substantial expertise in child exploitation crimes, and so it handles those crimes for us as well. But yes, to answer your question on the law, that is correct.
So how do you use that tool? Is it just the traffickers? Is it the Johns? Is it, so therefore if you're underage, you therefore committing sex trafficking, not just illegal. These are awful crimes anyway, but it's in addition there's another tool, right, for federal crime.
Absolutely, and in all of our human trafficking enforcement efforts, we try to go after everybody who's involved in the human trafficking, whether it's the trafficker, the customer, a hotel owner that is knowingly making money off of the trafficking going on in the hotel, somebody who's facilitating the trafficking. Now, as the Backpage.com case illustrates, and with the tools of FOSTA, we can go after websites that are intentionally facilitating prostitution or knowingly advertising sex trafficking. So we're taking a comprehensive approach and going after everybody that we can, because we don't want to do this piecemeal. We're not going after a one-off criminal here or there, because that person can be replaced. We want to dismantle entire enterprises and take down everybody who's involved in this heinous and egregious crime.
Great, thanks. I know this is difficult to quantify the magnitude of the trafficking that we don't know about, right? That's happening under our noses, but we've not identified the victims yet or the perpetrators. But this issue of, again, in your written testimony, the clarity was there of there's a difference between smuggling and trafficking, right? People are being smuggled across the southern border often, but people are being trafficked from start to finish across the southern border. People are being trafficked from where they are without having to move anywhere. But do we have a sense, special education, of the magnitude of people who start thinking they're being smuggled, so they're willing to, and trying to move and maybe paying somebody for that, paying a cartel for that, but they end up being trafficked, if that makes, so that, because they either can't pay, or then they're finding themselves in servitude and forced labor, forced sex, whatever that is. So it starts off as a smuggling, but it ends up in, does that make sense? Do we have any sense of the magnitude of that?
Thank you, Chairwoman. I believe you just explained it better than I could. You did explain it extremely well. We don't have a number. In trafficking, we've tried for probably the last 18 years to identify the number. We don't. We see, as HSI, we see it all. We see, and that's what makes it difficult at the border, which is somebody who believes they are being smuggled. When we're talking to them, either at the border or for investigative purposes, they believe they're being smuggled.
Right.
There's also times that we know they're being trafficked because of an investigation that we have with the Mexican government overseas, but they still believe that they're being smuggled. This creates an extremely difficult situation for whether it's CBP at the border or our agents. So I unfortunately don't have a number for you.
But is there, of the cases that, say you worked on last fiscal year, like what's the percentage of cases that are like that?
I don't have that breakdown. I definitely can look into that and get back.
I mean, those are the ones we know about, obviously, but I think this is just an
Correct.
important, distinction for us to understand. Some people are being trafficked from start to finish.
Yes.
Others think they're being smuggled or start being smuggled and finish being trafficked, right? And then they're stuck for a decade, right? The case that you talked about, I mean, some of these are just heinous situations.
Let's also not forget that there's some people that pay and are smuggled into the United States, and then they're here, and that's when they're vulnerable.
Right.
And that's when they're trafficked. So there was zero intent of trafficking the entire process till they were here for some time.
And
now they're vulnerable. They utilize, ICE and the threat of that in order to keep these people down and so they don't talk.
Great, thank you. Okay, I really appreciate all the testimony from our experts here. the opportunity for us to, again, raise awareness on these issues. There's some legislative areas there that we still have some more work to do on our part. But this is really not just a whole of government, but a whole of society challenge. All across law enforcement, all across civil society, faith-based, private sector, every single community member, family member, neighbor. I mean, this is all on us to raise our gaze, to look at people, each person who serves us, each person we come across at a rest stop, as we're stopping on a family trip, like each person to do our part, right? That if we see something, we have to say something. And so I appreciate all the work that everybody is doing here in order to address this scourge. We still have more work to do. And so thanks for your testimony today. I probably have something official to say here. So thank the members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we'd ask you to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7E, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. So without objection, the hearing is adjourned.